Welcome to the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. I'm the sports editor of the Herald Democrat, Jason Del Rosa, and you're listening to the latest edition of the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. We have reached the final week of the season. Whether you're playing or not, after this Saturday, there will be no more high school football because we have reached state championship week. All the games to decide the champions over a 4-day span. And included in that mix, once again, the Gunter Tigers, who advanced to the 3A Division II championship game for the sixth time in 8 years, for the third straight year. And we will talk about how they got there and what is in store for them as they remain the last team standing here in All-Texomaland. So let's go back to last week because we can't talk about what's to come until we talk about how they got there. And they got there by once again beating Canadian in a state semifinal, this time by a 38-17 margin, in a game that after the first quarter was, I won't say dominated, but definitely firmly in control. Gunter was down 10-7 after the first quarter, and they outscored Canadian 31-7 over the final three quarters, and were up 35-10. When Canadian finally got on the board with their last touchdown with about 8 minutes to go. And again, this is a matchup where you don't know what to expect going in. I know a lot of people felt that this would be a close game based off of last year and having it come down to the final 30 seconds and Gunter scoring to take the lead by a point and advancing that way. A lot of these games we mentioned last week have been decided by 10 points or less. And early on, it looked like that was going to be the case. Canadian goes right down and scores on the opening drive. Gunter answers on the ensuing drive. Then Canadian kicks a field goal right before the end of the first quarter. Gunter has a chance to tie the game with a field goal. They're unable to do that. It's looking like it's got a chance to be that back and forth, potentially come down to the last possession type of game. But after the first quarter, you could obviously see that from a defensive standpoint, Gunter was really dominating in the trenches. The pressure that they were getting on the quarterback, Cameron Cavalier, running for his life, having to make quick decisions, quick throws to avoid the pass rush. Canadian really didn't have anything in the way of a running game. Everybody has injuries at this point of the season. Gunter has a handful of injuries. They had guys get hurt in this game. Canadian comes in without their main running back. They did have some guys fill in, and I thought they did a halfway decent job. But a lot of what we talked about coming into this game, when you're facing a dual threat quarterback, is can you eliminate one of those threats? And Gunter shut down the running ability of the quarterback, and I think you could see that from both teams in that the game plan was very obvious that Gunter was not going to let Cameron Cavalier beat them with his legs, and Canadians' plan was to make sure that Walker Overman did not beat them with his legs, and they were going to try to make somebody else carry that load for each side. And for most of the game, Cavalier was not able to get anything going. I think at one point he had, I think in my story or just in tracking the game, I think he had 16 carries for 9 yards. And he finished with 24 carries for 90 yards because the last two drives, the last touchdown drive and then the last drive of the game when it was 38-17, there was obviously not as stringent a defensive plan. Gunter trying to get the game over with, and he was able to scramble for some big chunks a couple 15-yarders and run around and just get yardage that in the long run didn't mean anything. So on his last, I guess 8 carries, he probably had about 80-something yards just because of the way that the prevent defense was being played. And once he dropped back, he could take off and scramble a little bit. But when the game was in the balance, he could not do anything. They got some turnovers on downs. He was scrambling on a 4th down and fumbled. They really made his life pretty miserable. He was only 17 of 34 passing. He started off really well, and obviously that was why Canadian was up 10-7 after the first quarter. I think he was 7 of 7 to start the game for about 109 yards. He had 187 yards at halftime, and he finished with 244. It went way down in the second half. Gunter just, like I said, they took control of this game, both defensively and offensively. You talk about an offense that ended up running 70 plays. 53 of those were runs to control the clock. Try to keep the ball away from a really good offensive team. There was one drive, after, if you want to say a team has a chance to get back in it, the perfect example is after Canadian makes it 38-17, and there's 8 minutes left, and depending on how things go, 8 minutes can be an eternity. And they tried an onside kick, it went out of bounds, so they didn't get possession. But Gunter took 6 minutes off the clock, and then kicked a field goal with just under 2 minutes left. And that was essentially, and honestly, they could have tried instead of kicking the field goal. It was 4th and 5 maybe, and they were deep, obviously in Canadian territory. They could have gone for it and tried to just run out the final, 8 minutes. But they were able to control the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. Walker Overman, 18 carries for 97 yards and 2 touchdowns. And he had a touchdown pass as part of 10 of 16 completions for 118 yards. His main target was Kanan Lemberg, 5 catches for 85 yards, and he had the touchdown catch. Brock Body, 17 carries for 112 yards and a touchdown. Braden Hinton, 9 carries for 53 yards and a score. And it was not anything super flashy. It was very workmanlike. And it was a game that after Gunter went into halftime, it was 21-10, but it felt like 35-10 at that point. Canadian did next to nothing in the second quarter, and then Gunter goes and scores in the middle of the third to make it 28-10. And at that point, you really felt like I don't see where Canadians going to be able to score, 3 more times, 4 more times in this game in the quarter and a half that's left. They were overmatched in a couple of areas. Obviously, like I said, it's a great season for them. I know it's got to be hard because now this is the 5th time in the last 8 years that they've lost in the semifinals to Gunter, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that say, man, if we could just get past them, how many championships would we have in the last before this would be the 8th year, in the last 7 years, they had 1, and they had 2 before Gunter started this run in 2016 when they were down in 2A Division 1, and then Canadian moved up in that realignment for 2016, and I'm assuming they thought they were just going to keep on winning, and they've obviously been good enough to dominate the region. They've won the region 7 of the last 8 years, but obviously it's going to be a tough pill to swallow for them to get that far as many times as they have, and they've only gotten past Gunter now twice. One time they won it all, and one time they ended up as the runner-up. But there's probably, especially with the way Gunter has won its 3 championships. None of those games have been close, and I think it's pretty safe to say that Canadian would probably have won those games, if not as, not just won those games, but won them as handily as Gunter did. A lot of times, much like last year, there were people that said that was the state championship game in the semifinals. The winner of that was everybody knew they were going to win the championship. And there are people who felt that way about this year. We'll find out if that's going to be the case with Gunter moving forward. But they're just such a machine. This was technically their closest game of the season. The 21-point margin just beats out the game against Jacksboro and the game against Brock in terms of margin of victory. And it says a lot about a team when their closest game is 3 touchdowns. And this was this was really close to being a lot bigger than that, just based on that last touchdown. And again, it was a game that did not feel like it was close. The Jacksboro game, was close at halftime. I think that's really been the only game this season. Maybe the Prosper Walnut Grove game, because that was also close at halftime. But I think you could kind of get a sense of that Gunter was not going to be stopped in that game, and I think at some point Walnut Grove was going to make some mistakes, and Gunter was going to be able to capitalize on them. But the region final against Jacksboro, that game at halftime, there were a lot of people that said, "Oh my God, this could be the team that beats Gunter." And they were playing like a team that for a half that could. And then the second half happened, and they did not play at all like a team that could beat Gunter. And it's, like I said, it's very impressive for what this group is doing. They have one more game, and that game is going to be at 7:00 on Thursday night at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Cowboy Stadium. 15-0 Gunter against 14-0 Tidehaven for the 3A Division II state title. Tidehaven advanced with a 20-14 overtime win against Dangerfield. And obviously we just talked about how Gunter got here. This is an interesting matchup for a couple reasons. Obviously, one, it's a state championship game. So hypothetically, you are talking about the two best teams. Tidehaven is a program that had a little bit of a revenge tour / team of destiny feel to it. So they are in the championship game for the third time. They have won their previous two. Now they are not recent. They won in 1967, and they were the co-champions in 1980. Some people in this area may know about this because they shared that title with Pilot Point, and that game was actually a scoreless tie for the 2A state championship in 1980. It's the last time that a championship was shared. And for those younger people who are used to having overtime as a way to decide football games, I don't want to say not too long ago, but it's probably closer than you think to where people actually still played games that ended in ties in the regular season. So if it was 14-14 or 42-42, and you got to the end of regulation, it was a tie. And in the playoffs, if you played to a tie, the game was decided on penetrations. And you may say, what is a penetration? And a penetration was any time that you got inside the opponent's 20-yard line. That was called a penetration. So if you scored, obviously you would get inside the opponent's 20-yard line. If you got inside the 20-yard line and then missed a field goal, if you got to the 3-yard line and fumbled, that counted as a penetration. And so if one side had 6 penetrations and the other side had 4 penetrations, the team that had 6 penetrations advanced to the next round. And so obviously, this being the championship game, there was no game to advance to. It was to determine who would win the championship. And both coaches decided it's kind of dumb to base a championship off penetrations if we tie, let alone a scoreless tie. So they decided that they would be co-champions. And obviously we don't have to deal with that. If the game is tied, we go to overtime, and we go through that process and we determine an actual winner on the field. But so those are their 2 championships. Last year they got to the Region 4 final and played Poth and lost 12-6. And if you're listening to this and you're a Gunter fan, or maybe if you're not a Gunter fan and you remember your recent history, that's who Gunter beat in the state championship game, 42-7. So they got that far. It was their best season in a really long time, obviously, getting to the region final, having a chance to avenge that. They got back to the region final. Guess who was waiting there? Poth again. And this time, Tidehaven comes away with a 32-28 overtime win. Or excuse me, 34-28 overtime win in double overtime to get to the state semifinals for the first time since that championship in 1980. So they get to the semifinals, and that's where they play Dangerfield, and they win that game in overtime. And that's a game where it was a scoreless first half. They go down 7-0. They tie it. They go down 14-7. They tie it with 2 minutes left to force the overtime. They stop Dangerfield on its possession, and then they score to win the game. So if you're Tidehaven, there's a lot of maybe feeling of destiny. This is our year. We haven't done anything like this in over 40 years. We've had 2 incredible victories that had to go to overtime, double overtime, and then overtime just to get here. We're undefeated. This is the most wins we've ever had in a season since 1967, the first championship year. If we win, it'll set the record for most wins in a season. So they have to be coming in riding all that momentum. Gunter was supposed to be here. Everybody assumed Gunter would probably have a chance to defend its title. If they do win, they win back-to-back titles for the first time. They get championship number 4. It would be a 3 of the 4 championships would be undefeated titles. It would give Gunter a 31st win in a row. There's a lot of, obviously, things on Gunter's side because of what they've done during this recent stretch. So Tidehaven comes in, I think obviously they're the underdog. I think a lot of people would say, if there's a rooting interest, obviously they're going to root for whoever it was. If it had been Dangerfield, if it had been, I don't know. It's funny because Dangerfield and Tidehaven beat 2 people that Gunter has played in a championship game. Dangerfield beat Newton, and Tidehaven beat Poth. So we avoided a potential rematch of some sense there, which I like. I like to see different people. I think it's obviously interesting that Gunter's made. If Gunter does win, they'll have beaten 4 different teams in this stretch. There hasn't been a lot of repeat people that they've had to contend with when they make it to the championship game. So I think that's kind of fun that it's different every time. And so obviously the people that are going to be looking at this matchup, obviously Tidehaven's the underdog. People are going to be rooting for them. Knock off Big Bad Gunter, all that sort of stuff. How is Tidehaven going to do that? Well, there's 2 ways they're going to do that if it happens. One, I think, is their defense. So we talk about all year how good Gunter's defense has been, and Gunter's defense has been awesome. You talk about all the shutouts. You talk about holding people to a touchdown or less, and when you look at Gunter's numbers, they have that in spades. When you're talking about shutouts and the single game numbers. Now, they're not. In the games they have given up. Obviously, Jacksboro scored the 33 points on them. Walnut Grove had 24 points in that game. So there have been some games where they've had some hiccups, for them. But they've when you look at their defense and you see they've played 15 games. 7 of them are shutouts. 4 of them an opponent scored a touchdown, and that's it. So 11 of the 15 games are either zeros. So there's a 6 in there. There's 2 6s in there, and then a couple 7s. So they've been very dominant. When you look at Tidehaven, so they've played 14 games. They had one of their non-district games canceled, and they weren't able to find a replacement. So they've only played 14 games. So they played 14 games, and in the first 11 games of their season, which was the 9-game regular season, and the first 2 playoff games, they had 8 shutouts and did not allow more than a touchdown in the other 3 games. So in their first 11 games, it was either a shutout or a touchdown, and that's it. Now, the last 3 games that they've played, Rogers scored 21 points against them in a 56-21 loss. And we said the Poth game was 34-28 in double overtime, and then Dangerfield had 14 last week. So the most points Tidehaven's given up is the 28. But after that, they've essentially given up more than a touchdown 3 times. Now, it has been the last 3 games, which maybe you would expect because the opponents have gotten better as each round goes, which is what you would expect. But I think they have a defense that they feel is just as good, if not better, than Gunter's, based on the statistics and the way they've played. When you look at a lot of their scores, they look like Gunter scores, which again, I'm not saying anything that we don't know, because we're talking about a team that made it to the state championship game. They should have impressive numbers. You can't get here. You cannot fluke your way to the championship game. You can fluke your way to the second round, maybe the third round if you've got a bad side of a bracket. But anything past the third round, it's really hard to fluke your way. And if you have a lot of losses, maybe it's because of injuries, maybe it's because you're like Brock and you played, like last year, some really good people, and then you won your last, whatever it was, 9 games in a row to get to the championship game. But you look at what Tidehaven has done, and a lot of their scores sound like Gunter scores: 58-0, 56-0, 52-0, 42-0, 63-6. So they did have a close game in that first stretch of games that we talked about. They won a game 15-7 against East Bernard, and East Bernard is a team that has a really good defense as well. So if you look at if you look at what Tidehaven's done, they have done defensively what Gunter has done to a lot of people. The good news is that the last 3 games have been their 3 worst, in that they've actually given up multiple touchdowns in their last 3 games. But they have a unit that has been really good, the whole season. So I think if Tidehaven has a chance, they have to make this a game like last week. It's gonna be 21-14, maybe 28-21. That's how Tidehaven can stay in this game. They've got to do it on defense, and keep it a low scoring game, which nobody has been. Which Gunter scored at least 35 points in every game. The Brock game was their season low, and then last week they scored 38. So you gotta keep Gunter out of the 30s, I think, if you want to have a chance. I don't think this is a shootout type of a game. If Dangerfield wins from an offensive standpoint, the way they're going to do that is with their running back. He is a name that you should know. His name is Joseph Dodds. He had all 3 of the touchdowns last week. He had a game earlier in the season where he had over 300 yards and 7 touchdowns on like 23 carries. He is committed to Baylor. He's ranked as the 117th best player in the state for the class of 2024. He is ranked as the 52nd best running back in the country at his position. So he's talented. He's got some moves. One of the plays last week, they threw a little dump off pass to him, and he was able to get out in space and make some moves, and he can do that. And I would assume that they're going to ride him. They are a run heavy team. They can pass. Last week their quarterback Cale Russell, who's a sophomore, he completed 11 of 14 passes for 134 yards and a touchdown. They mix it in to keep you off balance. They find a way to, like I said, get Dodds out in space. And he's not a horse. He's not a bruiser back. He's about, I guess, like the dimensions I've seen, 6 foot, 215. He can move. And the question is going to be, can they give him enough touches, and can he turn those into successful plays? And again, like I said last week, they got behind. They rode him. He scored the touchdown to tie it. Then he scored the touchdown to tie it. Then he scored the touchdown to win it. And so I think that is the obvious recipe for success if you're Tidehaven. You got to keep it low scoring, because I don't think they're going to win a shootout with the way they want to play. And I think it's going to be how many touches do you give your main guy, your D1 Big 12 caliber athlete, and he makes enough plays to either extend drives or has the big play ability when you need, I don't know anybody, and I'm sure there are numbers. I don't even feel like Canadian did this. I don't think you're gonna grind out a drive against Gunter's defense. Like, you're not gonna have a 12-play, 67-yard drive, and you plunge it in from a couple yards out, and you take 5 minutes. If Jacksboro was able to hit on some passes, Canadian was able to hit on some passes. The first touchdown, I think, only was in 5 or 6 plays. There was a penalty there, a pass interference, to help that along, but it was, it's very quick strike, for people that, can have whatever scoring drive is done against Gunter. It is not a grinded out type of a drive. So, can he get loose? Can they find ways to maybe get some matchups to where he could win some of those battles, to get to the end zone? I think obviously everybody's picking Gunter as the favorite. I don't think they're wrong there. I think it is always interesting early on to see how one side that has, like we said, you have seniors for Gunter, a lot, whether they're a 2-year starter or a 3-year starter, and a huge bunch of juniors that have multiple appearances at Cowboy Stadium in this game, because Gunter has gone 3 years in a row. They were just on the sidelines taking it in, or they were actually contributing in a multitude of ways. And you have a team, like we said, that they haven't been here since the 80s, the early 80s at that. So how are they going to handle being on the big stage? How are they going to handle walking out in that atmosphere? And can they adjust enough in time against an opponent that treats Cowboy Stadium as its second home, because it has been, for the last almost near decade. Talking with some of the seniors, getting ready for this game, doing the preview and everything, and those guys, this run started when they were in the 4th grade, so they've grown up thinking this is all Gunter does. I guarantee you, more than a handful of them, made this trip to watch from the stands, when they were in elementary school, when they were in junior high, and then obviously, on the actual roster. So this is nothing new for one program, and this is, oh my God, we're playing for a state championship on the other side. And can Gunter take advantage of that? Does Tidehaven make some mistakes early? Are there nerves? Are there false start penalties? Is there a turnover? Is there somebody just gets overwhelmed and forgets an assignment? You never know. You won't know until you actually see them out there. And maybe that changes the direction of the game in the first couple of drives. I think I feel like Tidehaven's gonna hang around in the first half. I feel like Gunter, they just have that extra gear. They have that extra depth that it just wears people out. They can rotate people either side of the ball. The one thing, it was funny because the game last week against Canadian, Walker Overman had some pretty physical runs on a couple of his touchdown runs, running over people, running over multiple people, and somebody, and we were obviously up in the press box talking as the game's going on and what's happening and all that sort of stuff. And after one of those hits, somebody made a comment about it, and I said, well, he doesn't really have that many hits because of the way the games have gone, and he came into that game with less than 90 carries on the season in 14 games, because that was game 15. That's only like 6 carries a game when you average it out. And I said, this is not a typical offense where, either he or Brock Body as the main running back, they don't have a lot of wear and tear on them. And part of that is because they can cycle in so many guys, and they have so many weapons, whether it's in the running game, whether it's in the passing game, just like I said, despite some of the injuries that they've had to deal with, that they're so diverse in how they can attack you, that they just roll guys in and out. And same thing on defense. They've got guys they can rotate in and out up front. Obviously, they've got depth in the secondary just based on that's where a lot of the injuries have been, and guys that have been out for now 8 games, 9 games. Guys have gotten in and have gotten major experience, not just as in the second half of these games because a lot of them have been lopsided. But in these playoff games that they've had to make plays, they've gotten plenty of snaps now. This is not guys getting thrust in at the last minute and saying you're playing in the biggest game of your life because we don't have any depth on our roster. So I could see a scenario where it is, maybe 7-7 after the first quarter. Maybe Tidehaven has an early lead. But I just think Gunners is too good in a lot of areas. And I think we're looking at them being able to pull off the one thing they haven't done in this whole run is win consecutive titles. They obviously had 2 previous chances. They were unable to one of those years get back to the championship game at all, and then after the first one, they ran into a very good Newton team that had some D1 athletes on it and ran them to victory and handed Gunter its first loss in 2 years. So that's the one thing they haven't done. It would be a nice thing to do. Obviously, then you'd be talking about winning 4 championships in 8 years, and 3 of them in the last 4. Because you would. Oh no, I guess would that be 5? Because I guess that'd be 3 in the last 5. Because you'd have 19, 22, and 23. Obviously, Canadian got it in 2020, and then Franklin beat Gunter in 2021. But it would just be just a little something to throw in there for part of this run that we know potentially could last for 2 more years. We got some realignment news on game day last week that the UIL announced the cutoffs. The short and sweet version, which I'll give here, and we'll probably do a little preview when we get closer to February and really dive into what's going to happen. There's not going to be a whole lot of changes. It's probably going to be next to none, just based on the cutoffs that were released. Gunter missed going up to 3A Division I for football by essentially 9 kids. The cutoff was 369. I guess technically 6 kids. The cutoff was 369, and they turned in 363. So they're going to stay at the 3A Division II level for the next 2 years. So I think next time they'll be going up. I don't think they'll be able to skirt under the line for the third time, because they were about 10 under this last time, and the number went up 10 the last time from, I think, it was 350 to 360, and this time it went from 360 to 369. But Gunter is obviously growing. A lot of it is at the lower levels, but I don't think they're going to be able to hang under the cutoff next time, which I think provides some good symmetry, because it will literally have been a decade. We'll be talking about a 10-year stretch and what Gunter was able to accomplish in this 10-year stretch. We'll see what happens with the game on Thursday, and then what the next 2 years bring. But so they stayed down. Howe was able to stay down as well, because they were only 1.5 kids more than Gunter. So it was going to be either they both go up or they both stay down. There was almost no way they were going to cut right in between the Gunter and Howe to make that decision. Just in general, for the other cutoffs, Sherman obviously had to wait and see if they would be moving up to 6A. They missed by about 25 kids. So they get to stay down in 5A for at least one more cycle. I think the 20. So this is the technically the 2024 cycle, because it happens in February of 2024. So the 2026 cycle is the one that is going to be super. Super life-changing or has the seismic change to Texoma. Because then we're really talking about Sherman going to 6A. Then they missed it by 25 kids this time. There's a semi chance, depending on how the growth is in Denison, that they could potentially be in that mix to go back down to 4A. They added a lot more this time than I think they thought from 2 years ago, and they ended up not being as close to the 5A cutoff as they thought they would. So they're 57 students away. The cutoff number only went from 15 kids. It moved up 15 kids this time, as last time it went up 70. So if there would have been a huge jump, literally if it would have jumped the exact same, Denison would have missed going down by 2 kids. But the cutoff jump was not as big. But Denison is 57 away, and will probably be in this same scenario depending on how much growth they have. Could they drop to 4A? Whitesboro is one to watch. The 3A, 4A cutoff did not change at all. It stayed at 545. Whitesboro added 43 kids, so they got their enrollment up to 508. They're only 37 away from that cutoff. If that cutoff stays the same, I mean, the math is pretty simple. If Whitesboro adds that many kids or more in the next 2 years and the cutoff doesn't change, they're going up to 4A, which is exactly what happened to Bonham. Bonham went up to 560 kids, and I think they thought the line was going to move and they might be able to sneak under for 2 more years, and they didn't. So Bonham's making a move to 4A. So that's going to be something to watch with Whitesboro. And then the 2A, 3A cutoff only moved 4 kids from 250 to 254, and Whitewright went into this enrollment at 243, and Tioga is at 234 after adding 25 students. So there's a chance, depending on how much they move it this next time, we could see Whitewright and or Tioga moving up to 3A. So that's and to go back to the situation with Howe, depending on if Howe is adding some students as well, I mean, there's a chance that we could have Sherman, Denison, Whitesboro, Gunter, Howe, Whitewright, and Tioga. That's 7 teams. All could be on the move. And I'll tell you, and two, I should say this too. Tom Bean could drop down to 2A Division II for football because their number of 193 was only 11 away from not 11, 13 away from dropping under the divisional cutoff between 2A Division II and Division I, because that number jumped from 164.5 to 181.5, and Tom Bean turned in 192. So if Tom Bean just stays in that range and the number comes up like that, which I think that was probably one of the bigger surprises, because last time that divisional cutoff actually went backwards, which you almost never see. So for it to jump almost 20 kids is a huge deal. That if Tom Bean either loses kids like it did over this last 2 years, or just kind of hangs out in that same area, we could have 8 of the 13 teams heavily affected in the next realignment. But we'll talk a lot more about that when we get closer, and everybody starts doing the major projections and how districts are going to fall and all that sort of stuff. But so the cutoff really didn't tell us a whole lot. We don't have any changes in regards to that. It's just going to be who goes into what district and what gets tweaked and all that stuff. But we'll talk about that at a later date. We have bigger fish to fry at the moment, and that will be Gunter Tidehaven, 7 p.m. on Thursday for the 3A Division II state championship at AT&T Stadium. I will be there. I hope that you are there. If you've never been, it is quite the experience. I suggest going for the whole day if you're so able to. If you're able to get off work, if you're able to skip work or skip school. There's 3 games that day. The other 3A game, the 3A Division 1 game, is the early game this year. That's one of the other cool things about the schedule is they rotate so that the divisions get to alternate. You don't have to, like, the 3A Division 2 game is not in the same spot every year, because that would mean the Division 1 team would have to play at the earlier time or vice versa. So they alternate it, and they do that for all the they do that at the 6A level, the 5A level. It alternates, so that way it's luck of the draw that you may get an early game or a late game. You're not stuck in the 11 o'clock game all the time. If you're one of the 4As or one of the 5As on that Saturday, it rotates around. But the Thursday is going to be a really fun day. You get one ticket, you can get in for the whole day. 2A Division 2, unfortunately, Connsville fans are not happy to hear, but it's Albany against Mart. It's a rematch of last year's championship game that Albany won. It's 15-0 versus 15-0. Then the 3A Division 1 game is at 3. It's Malakoff against Franklin. That's 15-0 Malakoff against 14-1 Franklin. And then obviously you have Gunter in the nightcap at 7, 15-0 against Tidehaven at 14-0. So where you're one Franklin loss away from everybody on Thursday being an undefeated team. There's a couple. There's in the 11-man bracket. That is the only. Those are the only 2 undefeated matchups: Albany and Mart and Gunter Tidehaven. Everybody else either is both teams have a loss or one team has a loss. And if you care about such things, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's only 8 undefeated 11-man teams left. Now, obviously, 2 of them are going to lose for sure because they're going against an undefeated team. So the most that there could be is only 6 undefeated teams on the season. That's the max that we can have. But not just Thursday, any of the other days. I mean, it's $20. You get to watch 3 games, and I think all the games on Thursday are going to be really good. There's a lot of other really good games on some of the other days. I think the Saturday game with 5A Division 2 and the 2 6A games, you got heavyweight programs there. A lot of people trying to defend titles, much like Gunter. South Oak Cliff is going for a 3rd straight title. In the early game, you've got Duncanville versus North Shore. Those are 2 powerhouses. DeSoto's trying to win another championship. Anna for a semi, it's just outside of the coverage area down in Collin County. They're in a championship game for the first time on Friday morning against Tyler Chapel Hill. To tie that into our realignment talk, they will be moving up to 5A, and they'll probably be in Denison's district. So that's a little that might be that could be a state champion moving up into a district that already includes Lovejoy and Melissa. And if you're curious about the 6A games on the Wednesday, there's that as well. So I think there's some really good games no matter what day you go to. Like I said, it's $20. You get to see 3 games. You get to see essentially 3 of the best games of the season. And it's a great experience, whether your team is playing or you have a rooting interest or you just want to go see some really good football. So if you're going to go down there, be safe, plan to leave early, obviously dealing with traffic and all that sort of stuff. And we'll see what happens. We'll have a podcast next week. We'll wrap it all up and just kind of the overall thoughts on the season, where things might go with next season. And we'll talk about what happens with Gunter in the 3A Division 2 championship game. So if you're going down there, be safe. If you're not going and you have Bally's, you can watch the game on Bally's South, whatever it's called. I don't know because I can't get it because I don't have a system that offers Bally's. So that is obviously an issue for some people. But if you do, you can watch the game on TV if you don't want to make the trip down there. And we will talk to you next week on the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast.